You're welcome.
Sodom had WMD.
It was fixed around the policy. The British exposed that in the Downing Street memo. Stop lying to us. We don't appreciate your lies.
If you want to keep interrupting me, you can get the heck out of here.
Well, I'm going to correct you. If you lie, it's my duty to correct the facts. No, it's important to historically correct the record. No, it's about facts.
A biological or chemical material. Because Blitzman, in the 90s, he had a nuclear program that he was reconstituting that frankly was far more advanced than Western intelligence thought he could reconstitute.
Since we gave him the biological weapons.
We found 550 tons of uranium yellow.
You know what's rude is little dead Iraqi children, dead Afghani children, dead American soldiers. That's rude. Don't touch me, sir. Do not touch me.
Get out. I don't came out here to listen to your...
I understand, but I did. But when he was giving
You're not here to speak. He is.
But when he started distorting the historical record, we have the Downing Street memo. You're not allowed to lie.
The Downing Street memos are a complete fabrication. This man is a lunatic.
You should not say this on Passover. Oh my God. But what you have to realize is that, look, there is no perfect government. So where else do you want to live?
I want to live here. That's why I'm going to do my duty as an American citizen, even if others will not.
You communist, are you?
I'm not a communist. No. You are. It would be my right as an American to be a communist, but I'm not. I'm against tyranny. Right and left. Right and left.
Everything you said is stupid. I was born there. My sponsor was ex-Spiegel. You are a stupid liar.
But you know that Hitler then invaded Poland based on
You don't even know that. You don't even know that.
Yes, I do. I've read
history.
A lot of thunder.
A lot of thunder.
The cockroaches run, the treasonous scrambles away rather than just...
Shut up.
Screwed it up, you son of a bitch.
Good. It's like saying that I...
You screwed it up.
It's like saying...
You screwed it up.
It's like
you screwed it up.
Like you said...
You screwed it up.
Yes, Heinrich... Yeah, Goebbels came to talk to you and yeah, he ran away because he's scared
You
of that.
screwed it up.
Yeah, you should be happy. Goebbels is not the best statesman of the year. Next year, maybe you should come see Heinrich Himmler's body.
Get ready. I'm your host and moderator, Ethereal Veil. Seated next to me is your commander and centerpiece, Roger Denfer. How you doing, Roger?
I'm happy to be here.
You're happy to be here, and we're happy to have you here. 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 Happy to... Boom! Whoa! What was that? It looked like you just mentally checked out for a second there. Maybe you were looking down at your cell phone. Is that what you were doing? Checking on your last Facebook post about Farmer Bro? I agree. That guy's a real asshole. Fuck that little twerp. Okay. Well, now that that's settled, let's move on. 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 Whoa! What was that? You just did it again. You just had a seizure. Welcome back to the show. My name is Ethereal Veil, and this is Roger Denfer, and we have a very patient guest right now. We need you to pay attention, people. That's a problem nowadays. That's a whole nother show that we can get into. In any case, it is December 20th, 2015, Sunday night. We got a big 2-part series ahead.
Warm up some milk, get your hot cocoa, get into those bed sheets and comforter, snuggle up, and don't forget those Pepperidge Farm Milanos, mentholated Oreos.
It's a very minty feel we're going to have tonight as we're going to meditate on minty philosophical meditations. It is our honor to present Mr. Jeremy Rothe-Kushel to you. He is definitely an esteemed gentleman of distinction. He is a permaculturally informed, inspired, biased, guerrilla intellectual, activist, journalist, Future Roots hip-hop producer, and commons curator in radical Middle America. He is formerly with WeAreChangeLA Los Angeles. For those of you who aren't familiar with WeAreChange, it is a worldwide activist truth movement of guerrilla intellectuals, activists, and journalists alike. And I guess the MO is to confront, high-level politicians, various politicos, journalists, former intelligence officials, all that. And so you guys confront them, you ask them the tough questions that mainstream media wouldn't ask, or a lot of alternative sources wouldn't ask. And you were a big part of that. And you were part of the Los Angeles chapter of that. And I would encourage everybody to check out WeAreChange Los Angeles YouTube channel, and you could see Jeremy in action. Amazing stuff. But to start things off, Jeremy, first off, welcome to the show.
Thank y'all so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on with y'all.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about, your days before you got involved into activism, why you chose to get involved in activism, and, what you've learned, and we can go from there.
Cool. So I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and I remember early on my mom bringing me to a anti-nuclear march downtown LA when I was probably less than 5, something like that. So I think that I had roots in consciousness, of public consciousness, but I wasn't, highly involved, as a young person. I ran for office in high school and, did that type of thing in college. But I didn't really start getting more heavily involved into activism until I took a year off from college after my sophomore year and went back to LA and wanted to get a bigger view of what I was doing with my studies. And so that year, I ended up working for an activist group called Peace Action. So it was the peace lobby. You've always heard of the pharmaceutical lobby and the military-industrial complex lobby and the Israel lobby, but you don't hear about the peace lobby, even though there is one. But of course, it's not as powerful as those other ones. But when I worked there, I cut my teeth really at the activist level, not in offices, but doing canvassing, going door to door, doing a combination of talking to people, educating people, letting people educate me, getting people active to write a letter or make a phone call, and then also fundraising. And so it was a really interesting experience in terms of activating the fullness of the political activist for me, because actually I learned a lot just being able to interact with all kinds of different people, and plus knocking on people's doors is for someone who's sort of like maybe on the introvert scale like me, it can be fairly scary. So that was just sort of how I began to get over some of my fear, maybe, in terms of talking to people about deep things at the same time as developing my education in that realm. So that was sort of like a major step. And then, tying it together back to WeAreChangeLA, after I graduated from college, I stayed out on the East Coast and we did a lot of music, my friends and I, and we did a lot of hip-hop performance, production. We also developed an educational program called Hip-Hop Empowerment that we taught in all kinds of schools, from like rural Vermont to Boston and New York City, that type of thing. So I then moved back to LA, and that was when I began to learn about September 11th. As I began to learn more about the truth about September 11th, I began to want to be an activist around it and do something about it, and not just continue my education and speak to family and friends about it, but to do something publicly. Because at some level, I felt that the truth of September 11th represented what I would call both the philosopher's stone for an activist of national and global consciousness in terms of understanding deep politics, deep economics, that type of thing. But also I had this hope that it represented the Achilles heel of, the folks that desired to create a global empire. Because it was, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, domestic elements participating in mass murder, terrorism, treason, these types of the most serious crimes on domestic soil is basically 99.999% of people are probably against it. There's like a, psychopathic few who probably think it's justified, but, I felt like that was somehow a way that we could bring together the entire spectrum. There was a group of us in the local 9/11 Truth activist community that found each other, and we decided to start up an activist group that was a little more based on the power of the action, maybe like sort of, we didn't frame it this way, but maybe situationist, using combination of activism and media to draw attention to some of the information that we were aware of. And so we formed WeAreChangeLA. And we didn't necessarily decide immediately to be part of the We Are Change network, although we were very inspired by what Luke and others in New York were doing. But we realized that it was going to be more powerful if we joined up with this global coalition and started working sort of more as a cooperative rather than create our own thing of its own name. So that's when we started WeAreChangeLA, I think, in 2007.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, I'd like to get some perspective on what you think worked well and is worth continuing to do, and what you didn't think had much of an effect that moving forward isn't worth the same amount of investment as in times previous.
That's a good question. I think part of the impetus of We Are Change as a movement was the idea of speaking truth directly to power. And then there was also, I had this sense that we really should sort of shift the thinking of that phrase to thinking about how we could speak truth with power, so that we wouldn't always be conceiving ourselves as on the weak end of things. And there are pieces of the guerrilla journalism, the idea of a truth squad, some people would call it, political confrontation at some level in terms of confronting politicians that were at some level involved in the ongoing cover-up of September 11th, and journalists who were involved in the ongoing cover-up. There was a lot of potential in showing how flimsy the powerful's grasp on the collective reality really was, and that and at some level this is a confidence game. So that aspect, I think, was under-recognized a little bit in terms of the psychological potency of that type of thing, of like where, you can use words and papers to the effect of the vice president taking a security detail and hightailing it away from, some bearded, hippie misfit conspiracy nut, So I think that psychologically there's a lot embedded there. And I think there was always a lot of tension within the 9/11 Truth movement, if you would call it that, about these types of confrontational actions. Because I'm more of a diplomat at heart in a way, and so I'm not really one to desire friction or confrontation and that type of thing. But at some level, I think that a lot of the difficulties that we're confronting as a culture actually has to do with an inability or an unwillingness to deal with confrontation and conflict in a mature way, actually. And I think you see that in politics. Like, you look at the British, the way the British sort of just do their House of Commons, House of Lords conversations. It's sort of a little bit rambunctious, a little bit wild. And, meanwhile, back here in the United States of America, the Congress is fairly nice and pleasant to each other in front of the microphone when they're in the Congress. But outside of that, there's never been a time where the country's been sort of more divided in some way, politically, ideologically. So there's a sense that we actually need to learn how to get conflict and confrontation out into the open. But there was always that tension within the 9/11 Truth movement of people who said, well, you're scaring the people that we're trying to reach by being so harsh with people or accusing them of knowing things and, involved in treason. And I definitely learned a lot in terms of learning how to couch things and phrase things in a way where it had a more calm tone. I think it was trying to combine the academic way of phrasing things with the activist notion of there's a righteous indignation and passion and a sort of a reality of how bad all of this is. The spiritual idea of confronting high-level wickedness. That's a difficult one to hold in relationship, I think. The calmness of pursuing the facts as a way to pursue the truth of our reality, combined with the path towards justice. So maybe truth and justice, that's always is a tension to some level. The other thing that we learned about in terms of WeAreChangeLA, I really thought it was cool what we did around doing things like what we call freeway blogging, where you take back the public space to some level, which at a really deep level has been written off. And that corporate sponsors own the roadways. Like, they're the only ones that are really bringing messages to people as they drive. And so we would bring big blue banners that would have real simple phrases on them about information people should look up, like Google Building 7 or something like that. And it was interesting, the conversations that would happen with when police and highway patrol would get called. And, you know, a lot of folks in our group were really very talented in terms of speaking with the police, holding a firm ground of our First Amendment rights, while also relating to them as humans. So those were some of the positive things that I think should be brought forward, maybe revived to a large extent. And then the sort of stuff that I think we should let go of is the confrontational approach to our fellow average human being. And it's also a mindset of, like, the mindset of thinking about people like they're sheeple, or, you know, the unenlightened, unwashed masses, that type of thing. Like, that whole way of thinking about people, I think, is sort of passe, sort of dehumanizing. And I also think that it creates a type of potential insider, outsider, cultish type of mentality that is antithetical to a real people's movement. And so that's where I think we find ourselves right now, is this heavily divided political moment. But underneath it all, there's still this activist sinew, I think, that runs through the entirety of the left-right spectrum, of people who see things less as left-right and more bottom-top in a way. And where does one's natural rights come from? Do they come as doled out by governmental organizations, or do they come from nature or from God? And then also, what is the most important political friction that exists? Is it left versus right, or is it the people figuring out how to take the reins, driving our civilization out of the hands of obviously psychopathic, oligarchical, so-called elite? That's where we find ourselves now, is figuring out what are the key elements of a political movement that would bring all people of good faith together, if that were to be possible, and that would not replace one tyranny with another, and that would be durable and lasting into the future because it was based on a solid foundation of people educating each other.
That's a big answer.
That's a very big answer. Did you prepare for this, Jeremy?
No. I should have. I could have been a little more specific.
No. Well, you sort of dipped out for a while, it seemed. Didn't see any activity around We Are Change for a while.
I mean, obviously, everybody has their personal life, and they move on, they get married, whatever. We don't have to get into that.
So, yeah, WeAreChangeLA sort of came to it petered out a little bit, and there's always personal stuff to activism. And part of what I wanted to happen with the guerrilla journalism and the truth squatting was to really begin to get ripples going so that that type of approach could make its way into a lot of different political environments, because I thought there was a real rich, untapped resource there. You'd even call it maybe meta-journalism, journalism about what's not being said, or journalism about journalism at some level. But that didn't really seem to be happening, and so I sort of took a step back and began to dig deeper into my interests in permaculture, because I've always been divided in thinking about the world as a globe, and then thinking about my immediate experience and what are my responsibilities to my family, my loved ones, the soil right in front of me. And I met a wonderful woman through WeAreChangeLA, and so we started doing activism and started a relationship together, and then ended up starting a family together. And as we started a family together, we were involved in Occupy LA, actually, and that was one of the last political things that we did together in Los Angeles. And actually, that was like a key moment for my understanding of the potential of the realm of the public and the political, and that I felt like that a lot of people actually missed this crucial piece of the Occupy movement, and that it wasn't so necessarily important about the Occupy Wall Street, although that was a crucial issue then and a crucial issue now. But it was really what was started going on with the general assemblies, and there was an assembly happening every single night in front of Los Angeles City Hall. And we got deeply involved with figuring out the process of that, showing people that you could actually write a statement, and that if you did enough work and worked with enough different parties with their disagreements, you could actually come to unanimous consent in an intensely passionate assembly of activists. So that really got us thinking about a lot. And then we moved to Lawrence, Kansas to have our first child and to be close to my partner and wife, Lori's family. And so we started getting, into gardening a lot more and into local politics. And so there was a sense of maybe we need to go completely roots up. I always stayed engaged intellectually in terms of what was going on. And one thing that I forgot that I think would still be really powerful that we as an activist community don't use enough is the power of the phone call, the call into the radio show. And so, even when I was never doing videos, I would still do call-ins to C-SPAN and see if I could drop a little, informational
there you go.
sound bomb there, And then whenever people would come through Lawrence, like John Yoo and stuff like that, I would go over and clarify the record a little bit. But yeah, more and more as I could come forward to the present, I've been feeling the draw back into getting back on the public record in terms of seeing what was going down in terms of both the 9/11 Truth Movement and then Alex Jones and where Infowhores was going over the last few years. And I would keep paying attention to all of this, and I felt more and more in this very recent era, I felt that it was heading in a very dangerous and negative direction, especially in terms of Infowars and Alex Jones. And I would call at different times in the past year. I'd make little phone calls here and there, never quite getting out what I wanted to all the way, but little bits of interventions here and there.
You want to tell us a little bit about your confrontation with Alex Jones and Joe Biggs and any thoughts that were left unfinished because they cut you off?
Deep Cleanse is now back in stock. And if we could keep this in stock, it would be our hands-down bestseller. And we don't ever promote it. We don't really ever even talk about it that much. But the experts out there, the big vitamin nutraceutical consumers that know their stuff, understand this is a game-changing product because how much organic shilajit it has in it. Shilajit has thousands of different plants and other compounds that concentrated over eons together. And then it, in the summer, basically leaks out of the high mountains there in the Himalayas. Deep Cleanse has that in it and a whole bunch of other ingredients. It's a major game changer. Also, if you haven't tried True Nation Iodine,
Survival Shield X2, the good halogen.
Survival, it has done so much for me. I've lost so much weight. I've got so much energy. I've lost so much weight. I've got so much energy. So much energy. You've not tried it, or
Brain Force, or Super Male Vitality, or
Lung Cleanse, or Silver Bullet. But Jeremy in Kansas, I want you to hear this caller, was saying that we're in danger of being a fascist paradigm compared to the leftist paradigm. So I want you to hear what Jeremy, Joe Biggs, has to say from Kansas. Jeremy, go ahead and make your point.
Yes, just tying up the solutions to the global warming debate.
No. Hold on. I don't screen your calls, but you said you wanted to get into us being in danger of promoting fascism, basically. So I want you to specifically not get into your solutions for global warming. I don't think there's solutions to global warming. It's not happening. That's another show. I really want you to respond to the claim that you think we're becoming fascist. Go ahead.
Okay. I do want to show respect for the fact that in my days with WeAreChangeLA, I always felt personally respected by you, and I have learned a lot and have been inspired by you, especially from your terror storm days. But what I've seen in the last few years, and it's really becoming clear with the reporting on the Paris attacks, is really a going backward into the lower levels of what's actually going on here. And of course, there are cultural Marxists that are being funded by the Ford Foundation, but there are also cultural fascists that you appear to have aligned yourself that are funded by people like the Kochs or Heritage and that type of thing.
Listen, stop right there. Stop right there, because I'm going to let you make your points. I've never gotten one red Koch from the Koch brothers.
All right, so he goes on for a while, and this, I mean, I tried to cut it down as short as I could, Jeremy, but it's too long. So that's something that I was interested in. What are the connections there?
The point that I was making, I was very careful in my wording. It was, it's definitely not the case that I can see that Alex Jones is funded by any of these people. But if you look at some of the people that come on, especially around like the global warming stuff, the people through the Heartland Institute and that type of stuff, a lot of that is coming through Koch-funded, what I would call fake libertarianism. But also just the Tea Party. If you think about the alignment that Alex Jones has made with the Tea Party in the last couple years, and all the politicians that he supported from the Tea Party, like Ted Cruz, that was a big deal. Like, he definitely wanted Ted Cruz to become the senator from Texas. And so these kind of politicians, the Koch brothers, it's obvious they're sort of major funders for that part of the Republican Party. The Koch brothers, there's also Sheldon Adelson, for the Israel lobby. And so that is very obviously the political movement that Alex Jones has associated himself with recently. That was the point that I was making, that just like there's elements of parts of maybe Black Lives Matter, that eventually got funded by Soros or were started by Soros, that type of thing, there's an entire counter gang, if you would couch it in those terms, on the political right that is funded by people who take advantage of these, what I would call cultural fascist mentalities, where it's a lot about white resentment and the immigrant scourge and the Islamic scourge. And this is obviously has these proto-fascist hallmarks to them. When you have an economy and a political culture that's been gutted, usually by oligarchical elites that are way above the station of the average person in society, but then the resentment gets directed downwards or outward to people who are on towards the edges of society, or people who are below their economic station in life. So that's very obvious to me. But it's not very simple in terms of Alex Jones, because he's always stuck to the idea of a globalist conspiracy that's obviously oligarchical in nature, a new world order that transcends the left-right paradigm. And that's where I feel like he's gone backward the most, is in terms of this whole idea of the left-right paradigm.
Right. That was sort of the heart of your call. He's sort of going in a different direction. You said he's going more towards a fascist state of mind?
I would call it cultural fascism very specifically, because the cultural Marxists we would talk about, a lot of them are not for actually setting up some type of communist state, but their ideology has been framed through Marxist criticism or, Marxist analysis of the cultural realm of things. That is very much what I see. The stories that Alex Jones puts on Infowhores more and more get drawn from Drudge brings on and praises Michael Savage, or says, I don't want to infight with Glenn Beck, or has on Tucker Carlson. And a lot of the way that this political moment is framed is by these types of people framing the real threat to America as coming from the so-called left, the leftists, the socialists, Obama's a socialist. First of all, it's not accurate. And then second of all, this has always been my problem with the left too, is that if you really want to have an American Renaissance or a restoration of the American Revolution in terms of the, what might have been good about it, then you're not going to effectively do it by alienating half of a spectrum. It's the same way that I don't really have much patience for leftist activists who think they really are going to create a communist revolution or a socialist revolution in America, while you have at least half the American people who would identify, more towards the middle or towards the right and are heavily armed and that type of thing. So that type of, political thinking not only doesn't make sense at some level, I disagree with it ideologically across the board, but it also, practically speaking, is not going to fly. So if you're going to start doing more and more stories about the leftist nuts or the liberal retards or the Muslim invaders or that type of thing, that has the feel of setting up an entire group of Americans as a counter gang to set up some type of civil strife, whether it's hot or cold. But meanwhile, you're leaving the whole group of facts on the table that could actually align all of us together, and the facts that point to things like the Paris attacks as being orchestrated from a much higher level than some guys from Belgium, or as the result of some immigrant with a Syrian passport, which wasn't apparently even true.
Right. I mean, you can't really have a conversation about the migrant crisis if you don't talk about the wars in Syria. If you don't talk about the wars in Syria, you're basically avoiding the whole conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
You're talking about examining the facts on the table. They all point to a problem within the nation-state apparatus as it's presently conceived. It's always an intervention here or a lobby group here or some controlled industry here or there or advantages given to friendly corporations. It's hard to have a lot of these things that we're talking about without a malignant state apparatus, it seems.
Yes, much of the negative and destructive things that we see happening in our world today, there's a state-sponsored hand behind a lot of it. If you look at totalitarian leftist ideology, it's the state is in control of the corporation. If you look at totalitarian right ideology, it's the corporation in control of the state. Meanwhile, it's the same conjunction, and that's what we're seeing is a conjunction of state and corporate power that's really about serving a small group of powerful people.
Absolutely. And even talking about a corporation is a legal fiction created by legislation. In nature, there's no corporations. That's a legal privilege granted to some organizations and not others to confer benefits on that organization for adopting that structure. Corporations themselves, by definition, have a state-sponsored hand manipulating the market.
Yeah.
And the ordinary course of human affairs, even.
That's a good...
So even the corporate problem is a government problem.
True that. And I think we were talking about this when we were talking on the phone, but this idea of restoring a logical and natural hierarchy of sovereignty, especially in terms of our understanding, and that it is definitely the case that there is no corporation without a state. And really, if we were to think about it properly, at least in my mind, there's no state without the individual. If there's going to be anything that calls itself a government and is legitimate to any extent, it must draw its limited sovereignty and jurisdiction from the natural rights of the individuals who see it as legitimate. And it means that it must not violate their natural rights and only should act in order to help protect their natural rights. And then, like you said, that nature doesn't have such thing as a corporate fiction, So even beyond the rights of the individual, there's such a thing as the natural commons, and that the individual cannot exist if there is no breathable air or there's no drinkable water or there is no soil where you can grow your food.
I studied political science, and they have this term called the spoiling of the commons. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Uh-huh.
It's basically the assumption that it is human nature to take any public good that doesn't belong to any one individual in that group. It's human nature for them to just destroy it and ruin it, and they use it as kind of a justification for a mutual loss of liberty, because they say if there wasn't a state with a monopolistic control over this resource, people would go apeshit and destroy it and pollute it and burn it and desecrate any shared resource. I think we've internalized that to some degree. That perspective. We feel that way about ourselves, and we use that as a way to limit the natural rights that we should get, because we can trust ourselves, but we can't trust people 3-4 blocks away that we've never met because of this idea that without rules, everything would burn.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've internalized the mind state of suspicion towards our fellow human. There's a sense that the relations amongst humans would all fall apart and turn into chaos without the functioning state apparatus. Yeah, so I think that the answer to that is to restore the instinct that I think most all humans who act in good faith have at a really deep level, that most of the time they can trust their fellow human being, especially their neighbor, if they get to know them and they see that there's mutual benefit in taking care of their natural commons together.
I agree with that. But then in order to get there, we got to then ask the question, what is obscuring that natural human ability? In our culture, what is making us so divided from each other that there is this level of suspicion that overrides our inborn ability to work as a team?
This is where I felt the urge to really get back into focusing a lot on sort of the bigger picture, on the political picture. The reason that we have come to this point where we have been set up against each other is not only because we allowed it to happen, but because there's institutions and groups of people who gain, or at least they think that they gain, from setting us up against each other. And this goes right into the realm of what could be called deep politics, or state crimes against democracy, or the role of covert operations in the intelligence agencies. And, most of the time, people who study deep politics, we tend to think about the event or the act, the most recent terrorist act, and all the elements of it that appear to pretty obviously show that it's one more in a long chain of state-sponsored, deceptively orchestrated terrorism. But at the same time, the level that a lot of this divide and conquer mentality operates at is really way before the event and the act. It's actually at what I think you're talking about. It's at the perceptual level. It's at an internalized mind state of how we look at our fellow human being and what we think about ourselves as humans, actually.
Definitely. All the external possibilities a person manifests have corresponding pieces of their internal life. People in love with themselves don't end up with a lot of hatred for other people. People who are lenient with themselves and accepting of themselves are usually lenient and accepting with other people. And people who live in fear of other people are going to also behave accordingly in the external world. Everything that we see around us has some pre-existent correspondence to our psychological conditions and our unconscious mind and conscious mind and the things we've repressed over the years of our experiences. What we see is this kind of blind vomiting onto the political reality and asking, why doesn't this picture make any sense?
That's a good way of putting it. It's true. It's like the Rorschach Vomitage, as political map of reality. It's true. It's hard to see the picture with the spew on top.
The picture is the spew.
This is not vomit. So yeah, I definitely think you're onto something here. This, I think, relates to that article that you sent me that I think was really interesting from one of the co-founders of the Occupy concept or meme, Micah White, talking about bringing activism back to the internal landscape and thinking about the nature of our minds and the pollution and the toxic mimics and the corporate sludge that has been puked on our minds that we continue to puke up of our own accord all over our corpus callosum, that is, maybe where we should really start any real people's movement.
I'm going to throw out some quotes here from that article that I think illustrate this.
Cool.
Traditional politics has assumed a static mind that can only be addressed in terms of its rational beliefs. Blue activism believes in changing external reality by addressing the health of the internal environment.
There's an understanding that what's going on in our mental environment will affect what's going on in our physical sensory environment of the world around us. And the quote continues,
Blue activism begins with the realization that internal reality is connected to external reality, and then wonders at the relation between the pollution of internal reality and the desecration of external reality.
Whereas a dirty mind needs to pollute the world around it to feel any sort of connection to the world around it. And with the amount of intervention into human consciousness we've seen by propagandists and social engineers over the years, it's no wonder why we end up perpetuating that dirt and grime and those same ruts that we were taught to be in and encouraged to find ourselves in psychologically and philosophically. And the reason we kind of stay where we're at is because all of our strategies seem to be addressing the external world, the nuts and bolts of the situation, instead of the minds of the people screwing them in and actually building the apparatus.
Assembling it, yes.
Exactly, because you can destroy the blueprints, but if people still want to build that type of shit, then they'll just draw up another blueprint. We've got to change the thing that we're building together. We've got to find a new sort of architecture to share.
Yes. This was what was so compelling to me about what was going on at the heart of the assembly process during the occupations. That's what I felt like, that the standard left and the standard right completely missed the power of what was actually going on there, which was so there's a sense in the activist world where, like, why are we just talking about this? Let's go do something, why aren't we let's go do something. Let's stop talking about it. And yet, meanwhile, it is very difficult to find a serious, engaged, long-term public conversation about anything serious at this point, especially with people of different political perspectives and backgrounds all at the table together. So at some level, this is part of the architecture that we find ourselves trapped in, I think. And it's a purposeful architecture. It's even physical. If you look at the way that the United States was mapped out, I believe that this is true. I think I learned this from Mark Lakeman, who's from Portland, Oregon, who's about city repair. I think that's the name of his organization. But he said that west of the Mississippi, the town squares in large part were purposefully designed out of the equation. And that was what was so striking to me at Occupy LA, is that during the time when I'd first moved back to LA in 2005, I'd started paying attention to local activist stuff that was going on. The South Central farmers, we were involved in that, trying to keep the commons of urban farming going in a vacant lot. And then in the midst of that, there was talk that there was this big 20-acre plot of land in front of City Hall in downtown LA, that we were finally going to have our park, our little nano micro Central Park in LA. And so that was what I heard. And then, a few years later, it turned out, no, that's exactly where the Blade Runner version of the new Los Angeles Police Department headquarters is going to be built. That was the environment under which the General Assemblies at Occupy LA took place, between the City Hall with the white marble and the pyramid on top with the red eye shining down on you, and then on the other side you have the Blade Runner headquarters of the highly harmonized, federally consented LAPD looking down at you. So, and in the midst of that, there was this General Assembly process going on that even a lot of the controlled left wanted nothing to do with, and they kept on saying, this is absurd. We're not getting anything done. We should just reduce this to a democracy, a crude democracy, and vote supermajority and just make decisions and stuff like that. And there was a small group of us that kept on sticking to our guns that, no, this is the heart of a real democratic process, is to not alienate anybody, to have all voices who want to have something to bring to the equation be heard, and that the group is actually informed by encountering its own other that it must deal with in order to come to what was actually a much more natural and a higher order of synergistic intelligence. And that was actually the way that we began to see it, is that there was this cooperative intelligence model that was beginning to emerge in the midst of what looked to be another street protest.
But one thing it didn't do so well, like you mentioned it, encountering its own other within a range. But there's people who didn't even go, whose opinions were not represented in that General Assembly. Maybe encountered one poll versus another poll within the same frequency band. But people of totally different frequencies were not there and were not involved. And I think that confrontation would have taken on a much more hostile tone instead of the kind of friendly, cooperative tone of people who already kind of generally see a lot of things the same way.
Well, that was not friendly. It was not a friendly tone, even in the sort of midst of the General Assembly process of what I think you're correct about being a sort of similar band across the political spectrum of understanding. But there was some type of cooperative sense that evolved over time, and I think you're right that confrontation would happen on the weekends, when the local Democratic Party operatives would bring the stage in and the band in, and then whatever sort of Democratic Party operative, whatever Council on Foreign Relations, so-called liberal, Robert Reich, or, whoever it might have been, bring them in on the weekend and do the standard speak into a microphone to the masses, who'd finally come from the West Side to see what all the hubbub was about. And so there were some of us that were, trying to confront that in the moment, and who would chant, the people are listening to a CFR propagandist, So there was a sense of like that, okay, this is a fraud. And that actually we wanted to encourage the West Side liberals to stay and come back for the real General Assembly when it would occur during the week. But, of course, not everybody can make a General Assembly every night at 7 p.m., on a weekday. So I think you're completely right, is that there wasn't really an authentic assembly and that all voices were not really at the table. And so at some level, I really think that the assembly process was more important than the occupation, and that the assembly process could be used and replicated and sown at many different levels to make sure that anybody who wants to be at the table is at the table. And most importantly, that people, from different sides of the political spectrum who might live right next door to each other in the same town are speaking to each other and figuring out what things they can align over and where their differences are and where they can either come closer to each other or agree to disagree.
Do you think there's a problem with activist rhetoric being more suited towards people who are already activists about the issue than it is towards awakening people whom are encountering it for the first time?
Yeah.
A lot of Occupy seemed like these people celebrating their mutual political feelings. But the way they were representing themselves to the outside world, who is always skeptical of everything that people are doing together, what was presented to them was seemingly somewhat incoherent, somewhat partisan, somewhat naive. I'm not saying that these are always fair characterizations of the people involved, but how the rest of the world would perceive their discussion and the conversation they were forcing society to have rightfully. I think some things were lost in translation between people who are already on board and between people who are skeptical coming from somewhere totally different.
For sure. One thing that I think has changed in terms of the activist process is that it used to be that if you did get a big gathering together or a march or that type of thing, the large corporate news media would cover it to some extent, and they would show some of what was happening. And this is back maybe Vietnam era. Also, you would see some of, what was going on in terms of Vietnam and, dead bodies coming back and that type of thing. But of course, the perception managers, they got a hold of that very quickly, I think, after that era. And they shut down a lot of that part of the media, whether it was through the ongoing version 2 or version 3 of Operation Mockingbird and the intelligence infiltration of or control of the media. I think that is like a natural outcome or the purposeful result of the mass media at this point, is to make obscure and muddy the message of what takes place at the roots level. There was that sense so that the message got smeared. But what was interesting, it was almost not everyone, but a lot of people who did come down for the General Assembly who may not have been there before, there was almost, I'm thinking of like my religious studies of like a sociologist, Emil Durkheim, would call collective effervescence. He would talk about it in terms of religiosity, but also this core sociality of this sense of being together for a higher purpose is sort of ecstatic at some level. A lot of us who felt that and who were there and witnessed it and participated in it, there was a sense that like we couldn't put our brains back in that non-collective effervescent box. So there was a sense of what was possible. after that. And actually, what's his name? David Graeber, the anthropologist, who was largely influential in actually inserting the General Assembly process into the heart of the Occupy meme. In his book, I think it's called The Democracy Project, he tells the story of how it went down in Manhattan and how it started out as almost like the standard semi-Stalinist sort of event, Maoist leftist event where there's speakers on stage and standard signs and stuff like that. And a group of anarchists, voluntarists, got together and were like,
does anybody else feel like this is the same old bullshit and we need to, actually go over here and figure out what we really want to do?
And so they did that. And so that was actually where the seeds of the General Assembly process were sown. Graeber talks about that aspect of the viral or the infectious, in a good way, qualities of real democracy, that when people experience it, it's almost like they can't put it out of their mind. They might sort of go back to their daily life and not participate in it, but there's a sense of like,
oh shit, dude, this is what's actually possible with us.
I can't get down with CNN debates with my one or two choices, that once every 4 years I go push a button on a computer where it's actually being frauded from the inside through the software makers. Yeah, they finally understood that level of democracy is not where it's at. Not to negate the election process and all of that as a part of potential democracy, the moral heart of the truth movement had to do with that one's engagement with reality, with one's fellow human beings, was the foundational level of democracy, and not parties and not flyers. It was really about a direct engagement with our reality. There's always talk of psychological warfare that we are encountering, and that goes back to the way that the media covered Occupy and, tried to find the insertion points to divide the viewer from the viewed. But before psychological warfare, there's what I would call epistemological warfare, to the destabilization of what we know and don't know. And that the truth of our reality really has to be the foundation of any real politic.
The perception of Occupy movement was very much spun by the media in real time during the event. But that's something I think activism has to learn from and prepare for, is that people are going to be lining up to try and bastardize you and to marginalize you and to not have to deal with the conversation you're trying to have. So I think that's where effective communication is so important, and a certain mindfulness, because if you're really expressing yourself to the highest level of clarity, then no one can really spin you without, they can do editing tricks, and that's about it. So we've got to really make sure that our message is clear, the one we're putting out there, so people don't take and run with a parody of our message.
So crucial. Actually, that was one of the other insights that made me pull back a little bit from the confrontative journalism. We're not going to build our own foundation out of always reacting or responding to somebody else, and the only way that we're going to build our own blueprint or draw out our own blueprint in the way that you were talking about it is that we actually do that first and foremost. And that we begin to get down on architecting our own platform or our own blueprint of what we want to see in the world and make it very, very clear and compelling. And so then on top of that, then we can remix or rethrow in the power of the truth interjection or the truth action, what I would see as the combination of Gandhi's concept of satyagraha with like situationist political art, where you can actually make a move in the moment to disrupt the mind control message that's being put forth by powers that want to be. One example of that is like when they announced the closing down of Occupy LA, my friend Mike Murphy, who had his camera, went with me to City Hall, and I used my home-printed WeAreChangeLA press pass to get in, and Mike checked the mayor of LA and the police chief of LA when they were hoping that they were only going to have sort of corporate-y reporters there, repeaters there, stenographers to send it out to the world. But so I mic checked them and then read them the statements that the General Assembly of Occupy LA, little pieces of it, very clear, sort of truncated pieces of a couple statements that actually was what the people who were participating every night had actually consented to say. When the spin that was put out by the mayor's office in Los Angeles and then repeated by the media in LA was that there was no consensus on anything, they couldn't communicate with us because we couldn't ever agree on anything. And it was somewhat true, but the minute that we begin to actually start getting our process down and start consenting full on hundreds and hundreds of people to statements, then immediately thereafter, I think it was likely just a coincidence, but then that's when the shutdown occurred. That's an example, I think, of where you can then reinsert the authentic voice of the people who have sort of come together to make their own statement and then disrupt the statement coming down from the state and the corporations and reinsert the people's voice in it. So, so that type of thing got picked up by press around the world, and at least they knew that there was other statements out there and that there were people out there who also had a voice.
If you're not speaking for yourself, someone's going to be doing it for you, and you won't like what they say.
That's so true. That's a good point. That's like the avoid of political silence. And I think that is a piece of it, is that there's our private mind vomit, but there's also all this public political vomit that the divided left-right controlled paradigm puts out towards each other. And what happens is that the people who are of moderate thinking or reasonable or want to hear different sides, they feel ostracized in the midst of all of that, and then they don't come to speak their piece. So what we need to do is figure out a way to create an open political space, a political commons, where everyone is not only invited but encouraged to come and put their voice into the midst.
I think it also helps when everyone is not forcing themselves to all be part of one organization or entity together. Let's say you and I are having a debate in the General Assembly, and you've got a clear direction you want to go, I've got a clear direction I want to go. If these were communities, I could go my way and start my own community with people who agree with me, and I don't even have to debate you all day long every day. I think part of the problem we have of building a consensus is that we're insisting on that everyone is going to come with one consensus, all 350 million of us. And I think if all 350 million of us could come to thousands of different consensuses amongst ourselves, not try to indoctrinate or subjugate other people to our personal view of public will, and we can all coexist happily, even while disagreements persist. It's because our opinions are not binding on other people. I think it's more of a testing ground for liberty than it is a testing ground for democracy. Because in a General Assembly, your decisions are not binding on anybody. You can just fucking go home and say,
"To hell with those guys."
Or you can stay and be a part of it. Which is why it's better than a democratic majority rule state, is that you can just remove yourself from the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's got to be a part of it.
Amen to that.
The freedom to
opt out. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Not come with some Frankensteinian representation of a forced consensus that doesn't reflect anybody.
So true. I mean, what's interesting is that the enlarged perception of the idea of a consensus process is that it's about making decisions at some level. Of course, that's mainly how it's been used. But really, what's most compelling about it is exactly in the realm of what you spoke to, that democracy can be the platform for liberty. And that's actually the only legitimate use of democracy, is to both create a platform for and then to not shut down liberty. And that the most important part of it is actually the process of being able to come together to deliberate. Not necessarily to decide anything, especially at first. Like, if you're a group of 50 people meeting downtown, if you could decide on things, it doesn't mean that it's going to actually do anything. Even that realization should show you that it's really not necessarily about the decisions being made. It's actually about the dialogical process and the importance of difference on the table, and that difference sometimes ends up in a higher synergy. But sometimes, like you're saying, it needs to also go its own way. And that's actually a sort of an emergent organism in an ecological sense. At the edges, sometimes there's an important reason that someone sets out and starts their own project or their own community. Sometimes it may be shown to not work out, but a lot of times it'll actually show to be the next line for our evolution to follow.
Or some of us, at least, those of us who voluntarily embark in that direction. I think it would be very hard to say that there's one type of structure that will fit everybody equally well. if people know who they are, if they know about the options and the range of possibilities in the world, I think people will come up with a stunning array of different ways to organize activity rather than coming up with some facile codex to rule them all. I think that just shows the lack of imagination that we've inherited or allowed ourselves to experience.
Come on, are you a socialist or are you a capitalist?
Well,
are you a Democrat or a Republican? Tell me.
We're all operating in box consciousness.
I come from this box, and that box that you're in is my least favorite box for people to come out of, so I'm not going to engage with you in any sort of respectful level.
Which is completely understandable in terms of like how we got here in terms of human psychology, and that it's spiritually one of the most difficult things is an open space and figuring out what to do, the quantum choice of your free will, of your moment. Yes, you were born of all the dust in the universe to some extent, and all the genetics of your family and all the societies that your peoples have come through. But at another level, there's never been a moment like this. So you're all on your own. And that's sort of intimidating to hyper-prototypical simian with, 20 digits.
But it's also a thrill. I tend to side with the individualists that's where quality and virtue come from. Rarely do followers show themselves to be willingly led towards independent thought and virtue. I don't know of that one happening. So collectives and followers have often been committed to do the most unethical things to each other and to the environment.
That is true, is that the willingness to dissolve your own individual consciousness and, most importantly, your own moral responsibility into the greater whole or the collective in whatever shape it shows itself is perpetually one of the traps that we fall into, or some people fall into. It does seem that really, if it comes to sort of the creative aspect of things, whether it's in art or music or culture, or that it really is the individual soulful expression where the highest attainment comes. And at the same time, there are the social arts, I would say, or the political arts, where we are bound together in communion, whether we like it or not. Just if you think about the nature of language, and that we're not able to really think without the language that has come to us. And sometimes that's a gift and sometimes that's a curse. But it does point to the power of the individual to clarify their own statement, which I think harkens back to what you were talking about before, about learning how to communicate clearly. And in order to do that, you need to both speak with a language and an idiom that people would understand, and at the same time put enough of a twist on it or a new expression so that people can actually see it as an authentically novel message that's reaching them, rather than just another same old boxed out linguistic corporate product.
But I think it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, because it's hard to tell whether our thoughts are limited by our language or the content of our thoughts has contributed to what has become the content of our language. We have a word for newspaper because our brain conceived the newspaper and needed something to call it. Mm-hmm. But it still speaks to the need to communicate, and also sometimes the need to communicate beyond words. Language is mostly written in the past that's behind us. And what we're needing to talk about in activism is moving forward to the part where language is nebulous, because we don't know what the future of language is going to be. But we're trying to grasp at what the future of ideas need to be. I think in order to communicate things that are not linguistified yet in some ways, other types of art that are sort of transverbal communication are necessary. I think have been left out of a lot of forms of activism as well.
Like what kind of forms are you thinking of?
Music, painting, visual art. Yeah, I guess art in general. There's that Terence McKenna quote.
That art's task is to save the soul of mankind, and that anything less is a dithering while Rome burns. Because if the artists, who are self-selected for being able to journey into the other, if the artist cannot find the way, then the way cannot be found. Ideology is extremely alien to art. political ideology, I mean. And if you will but notice, it is political ideology that has been calling the shots for the last 700 or 800 years. We can transcend politics if we can put some other program in place. You cannot transcend politics into a void. And I believe that a world without ideology could be created if what were put in place of ideology were the notion of the realization of the good, the true, and the beautiful. You know, the three-tiered canon of the Platonic aesthetic. Reconnect the notion of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Then use psychedelics to empower the artists to go into this vast dimension that surrounds human history on all sides to an infinite depth, and return from that world with the transcendental images that can lift us to a new cultural level.
I wonder what role you think music would have in activism.
I just say the most advanced forms of communication that we know how to do as humans at this point is in the realm of the arts. Music as the combination of rhythm and tone, and then sometimes adding linguistic content and story on top of that is, I would think it's up there in terms of the most powerful art forms. But then also, if you think about action as art or activism as art, then you could be throwing in the act of music as an additional layer of art in reality. It's not a coincidence that the intelligence agencies of the world, and let's just talk about our own experience here in the United States, that there's been an intense focus on artists, musicians, and actors, and keeping a certain handle on that community. And even if you look at the work of people like Dave McGowan, in terms of his work around the Laurel Canyon scene in Los Angeles during the 60s and 70s, and the role of military intelligence in that they even would foment their own movements at some level. Also, it's obvious that people who have a powerful voice that are musical virtuosos, like someone like Jimi Hendrix or Bob Marley, these kind of people are an obvious threat to the order that is. So a lot of times they're dealt with, and it escalates until it's sometimes a mortal response. The answer to that is in the realm of what you were talking about, Terence McKenna, is to make art, is to make more art, and to make more effective art, and for more people to make more art. And then, of course, film, I think, is, especially in this time where we have the internet capability for people to transmit video, I think it's way up there in terms of the potent forms of artistic action, because you have the moving image combined with sound. So I think there's a lot of potential there in the realm of the synergy of music and film that has not yet been fully plumbed. We should treat it as a not yet fully manifested art form, but also with an awareness of the political content of the expression itself, and that people who do it with awareness or political or social awareness and content are putting themselves out there. But there is a problem of art that is sort of like crudely political. A lot of times doesn't seem to rise to the artistic occasion, and that it sometimes just dips into propaganda.
Exactly.
And not that propaganda is always off the table if you're doing politics, but art is art for its own, power, its own beauty. But beauty can serve the true, and it can serve the good, and it should serve the true and the good over time, but it should not sacrifice itself in order to do so.
Looking at a lot of activism in the post 9/11 years, it was very hard to see any sort of valuation towards beauty. There was a lot of confrontation, and given a diversity of tactics are going to be necessary. But I think it would have been helpful to have more voices on perhaps the more spiritual side of an individual revolution or a philosophical revolution or a artistic renaissance, because we've left out that part of the psyche from the change that we need to happen. I think we need the whole body of people online to have the change fully manifest itself, individual by individual. You've got to get the heart, you've got to get the brain, you've got to get that consciousness soup, all aligned towards a more just world. And I think people are drawn to beauty, always have been. That's why some people are hideous, so they don't get to mate and spread their hideous genes. But we're just magnets to these biological signifiers. And I think art is the same way. I think the best of people is reaffirmed, and it magnetizes the best parts of people when they hear something beautiful and rapturous and reverent of the complex beauty of it all, instead of just
Dick Cheney's a motherfucker.
9/11 truth now.
The answer to 1984 is 1776.
Yeah, you're right. We yearn for a beautiful expression of what's possible that's in full connection and dialogue with the nastiness of now. And thinking about this permaculturally, in permaculture, there's the idea of that the problem is the solution, and that the answer to your problems lies within your own perception of the nature of your problems, or the problem of waste. There is no such thing as waste in nature.
Right.
Like a tree creates, so many blossoms, not only because it's smart evolutionarily in terms of spreading your seed as much as possible and seeing who makes it, but, at some deeper level, there's an inherent beautiful expression that seems to come through nature itself. And so we must tap into that to not only be, fit evolutionarily, whether that's in a political, social, or cultural fashion, and figure out how to survive our crises, but we also need to figure out how to thrive and to live in a beautiful way, or maybe it's not worth it.
Are you familiar with the Tropicália Movement in Brazil in the late 60s, early 70s?
No.
They had a military dictatorship going on in the country, and the youth stopped wanting to play traditional Brazilian types of music, and the military dictatorship banned every other kind of music but traditional Brazilian only music, like Western music, rock and roll was banned. And the more that kind of music was banned, the more it became sort of a forbidden fruit for the youth coming up at the time. And they started coming up with more and more Western fusion styles on traditional Brazilian music, and came up with some of the most beautiful resistance music I've ever heard in my life. And then when you compare that to kind of like a nihilistic black metal, it's a cathartic release of one's emotional content, but it's little else than that. Whereas the tropicalists in Brazil were fighting fire with beauty, and they won overwhelmingly. A couple of the guys were sent on exile because the government killed them. They would be martyrs, and if they had them around, it would be doom for the regime. So they just banned them. They sent them to England.
It's like, get out of here. You guys are too profound for us. Get out of here.
It was Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil.
That's so dope coming out of Brazil, too, because I'm really attracted to that. Thinking back of the roots of capoeira coming out of slave rebellion, when the colonial slave state begins to crack down on the African traditions, the way that they are able to do their martial art, their fighting tradition is through dance, to frame it as beautiful dance. And really, you could even trace the capoeira as the roots of breakdancing in the boogie down Bronx, and the roots of the vital hip-hop tradition of encountering the crack epidemic with creativity, with aerials and spins, and the channeling of the competitive quality that's deep within our human nature into higher and higher forms of beauty and authorship and creative expression. That is where I think we could almost all agree to get down, is in one-upping each other in terms of beauty.
Alchemy. Alchemy, people. Alchemy.
Alchemy is not concerned with turning physical lead into physical gold. It aims to transform the lead thought into the gold thought, the tin man becoming a golden man and ending this copper bullshit for gold's sake.
Rudeness itself she doth refine, even like an alchemist divine, gross times of iron turning into the purest form of gold, not to corrupt until heaven wax old and be refined with burning.
It's a little bit sidestep, but I think its parallel is in permaculture. There's the idea of this permacultural flower that describes all the petals of what you would need to create a thriving life. It's basically divided up into the top half being the visible structure, meaning you're creating energy, shelter, food, soil, tools, that type of realm. And then the bottom is the invisible structure, which is the things that you couldn't see, but they're crucial too, like spirituality, art, music, communication practices. Even law would be included in that, or even things like money, potentially.
Sure.
You know, so there's a sense in permaculture where a lot of the focus of that specific movement has been in the visible realm, and so it's become sort of seen as really just an advanced form of gardening or that type of thing. But the gardening aspect of it is really just one petal of this entire piece, where the principles and the spiritual values of seeing value in the edge, or using small and slow solutions sometimes if you don't know what you're doing, that those actually might be most powerful not only in the invisible realm of society, but in the inside of our mind, in our soul. And that if we begin to permaculturally design our mind, who knows what could pop up.
Exactly, yeah. Gardening itself is a great metaphor or analogy for all of this. Because a gardener doesn't grow anything. He just allows things to grow that already are compelled to grow. You can't bark at a fig tree and say,
now. Come on, now.
I'm hungry! Yeah. You know, it's a stewardship in a way. And I think that metaphor extends itself to politics quite naturally, that we have to foster mutual growth rather than find some power differential that will allow us to get our way over these other people of a different mentality than us.
Mm-hmm. And continuing on that metaphor and thinking about that you're not really a food farmer. If you were a farmer of any sort, you're a soil farmer. If you take care of the soil in terms of water, mineralization, carbon levels, you create an environment under which the kind of massive microbial life that is what really feeds the roots of plants will flourish and create food that becomes a tonic rather than just calories. I think there is a political metaphor in there in terms of how do we cultivate our social soil, our cultural soil. And since I've been in Kansas, I have run into and learned a lot from a really wise elder who calls himself David Yarrow. What's funny is this actually is sort of one thing that I wanted to quickly drop in when I was calling Alex Jones after it was all about Lord Monckton and the divide and conquer surrounding the environmental questions of now. And so what I wanted to do was I want to transcend the whole carbon dioxide thing completely and be like, let's agree on, David Yarrow has this idea of instead of geoengineering, let's do geotherapy. And the way you do geotherapy is you put biochar, nature's nanotech carbon, into the soil. And the way you create it is by actually taking any organic matter and heating it without flame. And in the process, you gain both energy and heat, potentially. And then the end result of it, an incredible side effect, is this long-term piece of biological charcoal that is the most incredible green mansion for microbes that's ever existed. And then they'll move in, and then they'll be able to stash their minerals of all sorts into there and then be able to construct the types of foods that the plant roots want. So no matter where you fall in terms of what you perceive the role of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, everybody wants good food. And everybody wants to have soil that maintains its nutrients and maintains water and that type of thing. So let's transcend this bullshit left-right setup, environmental, capitalist sort of false dichotomy, and let's think about the kind of practices that make sense no matter what.
If something has merit on principle, then it's not very conditional. Opinions can be conditional. Ideologies can be conditional. Basically, our government uses a bit of every ideology, depending on what the condition is that you're talking about. But principles are not violable by this whim or that whim. They apply because of their universality. And I think we operate too much on whim, where we try to establish a principle, we pay lip service to a principle, but when it's actually under scrutiny, that principle wilts like a daisy, because that's what it is. It's just a delicate flower. It's not a sturdy principle that we actually believe in. We end up being less wishy-washy if we have actually explored our values to have enough conviction to live up to them.
That is the epicenter of the moral debate in terms of politics over the long term, is the relationship of means to ends, Really, I think, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but you can see the most fundamental debate around politics being those who believe that you can use immoral means to a allegedly moral ends, and then those who see it as a continuum of that the moral end must be built out of the moral means, or else it's illegitimate in the first place. And plus, it always, the project itself, this path along the way, it's in the heart. It feels right when you meet means to ends and don't, say, oh, well,
this is good terrorism because we're protecting, something that's, sacred, and so we're willing to, do good terrorism.
That type of thing. So that is the heart of any legitimate, honorable politics, I think.
And coherent politics. So we're not talking out of both sides of our mouth, doing the opposite with each hand. I don't even think that negative means can produce positive ends, because what you will get in that situation is someone who is willing to use negative means getting what they want, gaining prestige and advantage, to people who pay more attention to what seems to them to be virtuous. To them, it seems that the world is degrading because we've got people in positions of authority willing to use indecent means to accomplish what to indecent people is a good aim. But to decent people, not using indecent means is the end for a lot of moral actions. Once you begin embodying that indecency which you oppose, the more you should just trap yourself in the closet and not do anything, because whatever ends you enact are not going to be just.
Yeah, when was the last time someone used, some shady tactics, and then once they came to power, they put that all aside and they ruled with honor? Exactly. It doesn't happen, dude.
It doesn't. It's only used for plausible deniability after the terrible deeds are already done. They say, well,
why did you bomb everyone in Iraq and Afghanistan?
And then George Bush will say, we haven't had another terrorist attack, right? It's a total obfuscation of causality, but we'd rather you didn't keep us safe because you're the thing we need to be safe from.
Yeah. Are you with us or are you with the terrorists? No, you're one of the terrorists, so we're not with you nor these other terrorists, because you guys are the terrorists. And this is brass tacks when it comes down to realpolitik, especially in America, in this currently ongoing American empire, and the way that the incursion into Afghanistan was sold to the liberals, like hellfires for human rights, and like where this is all about women's rights in Afghanistan, and
we're going to bring morality to them whether they like it or not.
This is the way that politics is run. And of course, all different constituencies have their own toxic mimic meme that's sold to them. And usually it does come down to that the left is sold human rights narrative and the right is sold a security narrative.
And nobody gets either one. That's the funny part. That's the best part. They're both a shell game. How can a military-industrial complex make you safe when it just ends up arming every enemy you'll ever potentially have?
And of course, this is where the truth of reality actually can help us create a coherent picture of what's actually going on. And that so these fake memes that are sold to these different political constituencies can actually be dissolved in the solution of truthful analysis, which is that, no, this is about neither one of these things. And as you're playing the shell game and chasing your security here or your human rights there, what's really under the third nut is more terrorism, more tyranny. What's so interesting is W was always sort of speaking the truth to you at some level, you know, in a crypto fashion, and he was like, you know, they attacked us because they hate our freedom, you know, and then the left was like, no, it's about blowback, and it's because of American foreign policy. But at some level, Bush, he's like, no, the people who attacked us did attack us, you know, because they hate our freedom. That's why, you know, they're helping us get rid of us, 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 get rid of us.
Disturbing to me that people who claim their Jewishness would use terror and blame it on
but you have to be very careful, though, because that argument has been taken up by the Arab world, obviously, to suggest that, you know, Mossad or something. I want to hold my tongue because I certainly have no evidence. I have no evidence to suggest any of that is true.
But there's a lot more evidence to connect Mossad with 9/11 than there is to connect Muslims with 9/11. And the fact that we're willing to go and defend the official story that says only Muslims are capable of bloodthirsty acts like that, and not Christians and Jews.
We're gonna.
That's what's disturbing to me as a Jewish man. I don't want my own Jewish people to allow other people in our name to use terror and blame it on our half-brothers, the Muslims.
Okay.
And the Mossad has a very long track record of doing it, and so does the CIA.
Okay.
And so we got to stop them. Governor, with the continuing dip of public confidence in the president, lowest approval ratings in history, Congress is even below that. 50% of Americans say they would vote to replace the entire Congress. In Mayor Bloomberg City, at least 50% of the people there believe that there's a serious cover-up of the attacks of 9/11. The mayor has positioned himself apparently against the thousands of family members that don't have their questions answered, the first responders. So are we not, is not Proposition 11, even if it is a good proposal, aren't we just rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic of public faith in our public officials? So, Mayor, do you support a new WeAreChangeLA? Do you support a new investigation of 9/11? Do you, sir? Well, the cover-up itself is treasonous under Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, sir, so I suggest that you support it. Governor, my legal and moral responsibility to give you these papers about the treasonous cover-up of 9/11. Do you support a new investigation, sir?
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here.
Do you support a new investigation, sir? Are you wearing your death skull belt buckle, sir? Are you, sir? Why did you put yourself on the cover of Time with a death skull belt buckle, sir? You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome.